Welcome to the studio. Pull up a chair because today we're going to be painting these lovely ladybugs. And I also created a tutorial companion guide for you in which you will find a detailed breakdown of the ladybug body and some whimsical marks if you need a little bit of inspiration on how you can design your ladybugs, as well as the various attempts that I created in preparation for this tutorial. So let's get our supplies ready and make some magic. Of course, clean water. And then I've already pulled the 4 colors I'll be using. You can use the ones that you've got on hand. Today I am using 4 colors from Daniel Smith: Payne's Gray. I almost always use Payne's Gray, Undersea Green, and Deep Sap Green, as well as quinacridone red. Quinacridone red? I'm pretty sure I need to pronounce that better, but these are the 4 colors. Then I have my shimmer palette from Arteza to add shimmer details at the end. I'll be using 3 brushes today, the 7, 5, and 1. A heat gun, and then the paper I'm using is this watercolor paper block from Layton, the 10x7, and I'm going to be using some masking tape to create some edges. And I finally got this chunky one. It's from Just Art. I think it's 1 inch, and I'm going to be adding it to every edge. I want to create 2 corners, so it's going to look like this. This is my whimsy journal, and this tutorial is inspired by this spread. And so I want to have basically a leaf with a ladybug here, and then another one here with a ladybug baby, a third. We'll see how it goes, but I want to have a nice edge for those leaves. And so this is quite sticky, so what I'm going to do before I place it on my paper is put it on the edge of the table to remove some of the stickiness from the tape so that when I peel it off, it won't tear off any of the paper. So this is what I do to make it less abrasive on the paper. And about 2 passes, and then I put it back on the paper. Now I'm going to put a little bit of water in this ceramic bowl and put a little bit of that undersea green in here because I want a very light first layer for the leaves so that it's light enough that the red of our ladybug will come out nice and bold on it. I'm going to be doing this wet on dry, but you can absolutely paint this wet on wet if you want a softer, looser feel. It'll allow the pigment to move a little bit more and bloom and create these organic variations in the watercolor. And so I'll be placing some green here with my finger and here. Sometimes watercolor makes the first decision for you, but instead of fighting it, I just let it guide where I was adding these leaves. And I'm giving a kind of an oval shape here to where I could possibly have leaves and a little bit of splatter for a softer edge, and perhaps rolling the brush to get a soft background, soft edge. And same thing on the other side. As I work my way across to the other side, I'm intentionally trying not to recreate the exact same composition as the other side because I want each side to feel a little different while still feeling like they belong together. I'm also making sure to leave plenty of open space in the middle because I'm thinking I may add some lettering in our final layer. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, so I want to leave myself enough room to play and make that decision as this develops. A little note from future me, I really wish I had added a touch more green to these leaves at this stage. So if yours is feeling like they could use a little bit more dimension, feel free to drop a little bit more green. Now for the ladybug, I'll be using a size 5 brush. And this is the construction of the ladybug. We'll start off with the outline of the body and then start filling it in, and then leave a little bit of an open space here. If you can't leave that open space, don't worry, you can always go back in and add a line like this one. You can add a black line or Payne's gray line. And then we're going to come in and do the head and the whimsical antenna, add the legs, and then the whimsical beauty marks. A quick note before we start adding our ladybugs. I did let the leaves dry completely first. You want that first layer to be dry so that the red stays where you place it instead of bleeding into the leaves. So first our body, and I start with a gentle curve edge here. Then come around and do the side. Curve at the bottom, and then connect here. And now we're going to fill it in and try to leave a gap. If you get too close and you have no gap, you can always add a line at the end. And now we just fill in. I just realized I told you I was going to use my number 5 brush, but I'm actually using my number 1. Your brush will really depend on the size of your paper and how large you want your ladybugs to be. The number 1 ended up working perfectly for me because I wanted mine to stay pretty small. I really like using these tapered mop brushes because they hold a generous amount of watercolor, but that fine point still gives me quite a bit of control. And now we're going to do 2 more on this side. We're going to let that dry before we add the antenna and the head. We're going to do a small one here. Same process. The number 1 brush was perfect here. I think if I wasn't already using it, I most likely would have switched because I really wanted this small ladybug here. And this one will do the black line at the end. So we're just going to fill it all in. You may have already noticed the way I'm positioning my hands here. I place my left hand underneath my right wrist for 2 reasons. First, it gives me a little distance between my painting hand and the paper, so I don't accidentally smudge the little ladybug that's underneath my hand. But it also gives my wrist some extra stability. Because of the angle I'm painting at, I don't have quite as much control as I normally would. Resting my wrist on my other hand gives me a steadier base and helps make those tiny, more intentional brush strokes. So if you ever find yourself working in a tight area or at an awkward angle, try giving your painting hand a little extra support. I'm coming in here as slowly and precisely as I can to make that white space just a little narrower. This can be a bit of a gamble because it's very easy to go a little too far, but having my hand supported gave me more control over the tip of my brush. Okay, now I'm going to use some Payne's gray to add the head and the whimsical antennas. And for the head, we're going to follow the outline that we did for the body. Just curve along it. And then you can start with the tip of your brush and then put the belly down to help form what I'm calling the neck. And then a little C here where we're going to place our antenna. And then with the tip of the brush, we're going to drag a thin line from the head out. And I like to create really long antenna and then curve into a spiral. And then another one. And I like to do one a little shorter. And again, the spiral. And we're going to repeat that process on the other two ladybugs. And this one, we're going to be careful because it's on the edge. At least on my paper, it's close to the edge. So I'm going to give it a very small neck and head. Same process. And smaller antenna. Last one. Following the shape of the body, dragging, then using the belly of the brush. Smaller C. And then antenna. Got too close there to the edge of the tape. Now we're going to dry this to add our legs. Now for the legs, and we're going to continue using Payne's Gray. And for the legs, there will be 6. And we're first going to do one thin V-stroke, and then we're going to come back in and add a little thickness to the part of the leg that's closest to the body of the ladybug. We're going to do one closest to the head.
Take your time here. It'll help you get those really thin lines for the legs.
And then come back in and add thickness. One towards the middle. And then one towards the bottom. And this one, the ones that are towards the bottom, I like to angle down. And again, some thickness. And then we're going to repeat that on the other side, and then for the other two ladybugs.
This is where that pointed tip really comes in handy. I love these tapered mop brushes because they're incredibly versatile. I can use the belly of the brush to hold plenty of water and pigment for those larger, looser strokes, but then I can come right onto the fine point for tiny details like these. If your brush doesn't have a fine point, you may want to switch to a smaller brush for this part. You don't need the exact brush I'm using. You just want something that gives you enough control to comfortably create these finer marks. There's something about adding these tiny details that relaxes my mind. It reminds me a little bit of stippling. There's a rhythm to it. You make one mark, and then another, and another, and eventually you stop thinking so much about each individual stroke. I think that's one of the things I love most about working on these little details. My hands have something simple to focus on, and my mind gets to quiet down for a little while. And since we're not rushing this part, we can settle into the repetition and let ourselves enjoy those tiny marks one at a time. You might even notice that as you go, your marks start to feel a little more natural. You find a rhythm of your brush. Touch, lift, move on. Touch, lift, move on. It's almost meditative. Sometimes we're so focused on getting to the finished painting that we forget we're allowed to enjoy the process of actually getting there. These little repetitive details might not dramatically change the painting with every single stroke, but they give us a place to slow down and just be with what we're making. So if you find a particular mark or part of the painting that quiets your mind like this, linger there. You don't have to rush through it just because it's a small detail.
Now we're going to come in and add our beauty marks, and you can have fun with this. I did filled in hearts, and then I did little designs in them, all centered on hearts because hearts make me happy. This one might be my favorite. And I've also included in the tutorial companion guide a few more options, so have fun with this step. I'm going to start with our tiniest little ladybug because I want to remember to do a little line similar to this one, and I may even do the little hearts and then come back in with some red shimmer with those lines. There we go. So just a thin line down the middle. You can even make it a little fragmented, and then we'll add half of a heart here, another half of a heart, a swirl that comes down, also in the shape of a heart, and then we'll do a heart and a few dots. And then a little line here, some dots. All right, on to the next one. And this one will have a wide half heart and another wide half heart, little line, and then we'll do a little fragmented line down the side, and then a little half, then we'll come down into a spiral. A dot and a dot, and then a little V and a little V. Almost like a skeleton. Okay, on to our last ladybug with some beauty marks. And this one we're going to do 3 hearts on each side. So we'll do a heart here, and then we'll put it furthest, and I think we'll actually do, it's kind of big, so we'll do 4 hearts on each half. And then a few dots. All right, now let's dry that, and then we'll come back in and add detail to our leaves. Okay, now I'm going to take off the masking tape because I actually want to define some of these edges with some watercolor.
I'm taking my time as I remove the tape. Even though I removed a lot of the stickiness before putting it down, there could still be quite a bit of grip on the paper. So I'm pulling it back slowly and gently rather than rushing through this part. The last thing we want after all that painting is to tear the surface of our paper. So just take your time, keep an eye on how the paper is responding, and work your way around until all of that tape is off safely. For a lot of my watercolor explorations, I tend to let the paint create its own natural edges. I love that loose, organic feeling and not always knowing exactly where the watercolor is going to end. But every once in a while, like here, I really enjoy switching things up and giving myself a defined edge like this. Framing is something really fun to explore in your own work. You can let elements stay completely inside the border or have a few leaves or marks break through it. Play with leaving areas open like I did here.
Okay, and I think the first green that I used was actually deep sap green. So we're going to come back in and add some outlines with that. Just following along the little edge of the leaf that we created in that first loose layer.
I'm keeping the lines on the leaves that are holding the ladybugs fragmented so that they don't overwhelm the ladybug, and the focus is on our gorgeous ladies.
And then we're going to add some lines for the veins of the leaf.
As I'm adding these lines, I'm trying to pay attention to their direction. I'm trying to keep them parallel to each other, coming at that center line at the same angle. They don't have to be perfectly measured or evenly spaced, and I definitely don't want them to feel that precise, but having that center line as a guide gives all these smaller marks a sense of direction. And as we continue adding details to these leaves, we want to make sure we're paying attention to their intensity, because even though we are giving attention to these leaves, we want to make sure that the ladybugs stay the star of these pieces. If we add too much detail, then the leaf starts to compete for attention. Every time you create a piece like this with multiple elements, you're giving yourself the opportunity to practice so much more than simply painting something you may have never painted before. You're also training your eye to see. You're learning to notice where your attention goes, what feels too busy, what feels too quiet, and how all those elements work together. And at the same time, you're training your hand and building that muscle memory to eventually create that balance on the page. Because if everything in a painting is demanding your attention, nothing really gets your attention. Your eye doesn't know where to go. So think of some of those details as your supporting characters. They're important, they help tell the story, but they don't need to all be the star. In this painting, our ladybugs are the main character. I want those beautiful little pops of red to be what catches your eye first, while the leaves, lines, and smaller details support them. And the more you create, the more naturally you'll begin to recognize that balance for yourself.
Now we're going to come in with some undersea green.
And I'm actually going to save that last leaf underneath the third ladybug for a little bit later. I want to first build out some of the details around the rest of the piece so I can get a better sense of what that leaf is going to need. I know I want to introduce some darker values and a few additional elements that will help guide your eye for one group of leaves across the composition to the other. Sometimes it helps not to make every decision right away. Leaving one area unfinished gives me a place to come back to once I can see how the rest of the painting is developing and what it needs to feel balanced. Before I'm starting to fill the centers of these leaves, I'm going around and outlining them first. I really want to maintain that framed edge we created with the masking tape, so the outline gives me a little barrier and helps me control where the watercolor is going to move. And while I'm working through this section, I want to tell you a little bit about how I create these tutorials. I don't have a finished painting sitting beside me that I'm trying to recreate exactly. I usually do a few explorations beforehand, which are the ones you see in the companion guide, so that I have a rough idea of what I want to paint and which techniques I want to share with you. But when it comes time to actually film the tutorial, I'm painting the piece once and bringing you along with me as I'm figuring it out. And that's important to me because I want you to see that creating isn't always a perfectly mapped out process. I'm making decisions, I'm changing my mind, I'm responding to what the watercolor is doing. Sometimes something works beautifully, and sometimes I immediately think, okay, next time I would do that differently. For example, the tiniest ladybug, now that I'm watching this back, I see that the color is a little flat, and I wish it looked a little bit more like the ladybug on the side that I'm currently working on. There are also areas like the leaf that I just painted a few moments ago. I wish I had done wet on wet, which I did end up transferring to doing a wet on wet just to get richer variations in color. And watching this back gives me another opportunity to evaluate these decisions. And I think learning how to do that is a very important part of developing as an artist. Sometimes we finish something, look at it, and our entire critique is simply, I don't like it. But I don't like it doesn't actually give us anywhere to go. Instead, get curious about why. What specifically isn't working for you? Is there not enough contrast? Did the colors become muddier than you wanted? Does the composition feel unbalanced? Is there an area that has too much detail? Do you wish that you would have left more white space? Instead of just asking, do I like this? Try asking, what can this teach me? Find the parts that you would change next time, but also find the parts that you would absolutely do again. Because that second part is perhaps more important than the first part, because those are clues to the things that are part of your artistic fingerprint. I have found that these marks here are part of mine because they bring me joy. Because the leaves with our ladybugs are relatively light, and I really want the pops of the red to be bold, I'm making the surrounding elements darker. This is another way that we can use value to create the illusion of depth and layering. Think of our lightest leaves as sitting closest to us, and then as we work our way further into the background, we can gradually deepen those values. That contrast helps separate the different layers while keeping our ladybugs as the main characters. I am also adding some darker elements over the side to help balance the composition and guide your eye across the page. And of course, those are in the shape of my swirls, just a small part of it. And if you painted with me before, you know how much I love those brush strokes. They find their way into so many of my paintings because they are part of my artistic fingerprint. I find that they add movement and just the right amount of whimsy. And if they bring you joy too, borrow them, make them your own. And if they don't, this is a perfect place to experiment with a mark that feels more like you. I'm going to finish outlining this last leaf with our ladybug using the undersea green, and then I'm going to switch over to the deep sap green to add some darker elements where these two leaves meet. I want to echo some of what we created on the opposite side. I don't want the two sides to be exactly the same. I love that they're a little different, but I do want them to share some of the same visual language. By repeating the same colors and values and marks on both sides, we create a relationship between them. Your eye recognizes those similarities and naturally begins traveling from one side of the painting to the other. So we're not trying to create symmetry here, we're creating connection. Since I was able to get such a rich, deep sap green where those two leaves meet, I'm going to bring a little of that darker value into this corner to help balance the composition. This is a great moment to stop, take a step back, and look at your painting as a whole. Notice where your darker values are sitting. Is there an area that could use a little more detail or a stronger concentration of pigment to help move your eye around the page? You don't necessarily need to add more everywhere. Sometimes repeating just a touch of that darker value somewhere else is enough to make the whole composition feel more connected and balanced. I'm adding these little detail lines to the leaf, again, being really mindful of how dark my pigment is. I'm keeping the lines light and a little fragmented so they don't compete with the tiny details we worked so hard to create on our ladybug, especially the antenna and the legs. I want the leaf to have enough detail to feel interesting, but I still want our ladybug to be the first thing your eye notices. And now that I've created such a beautiful area of dark contrast over here, I'm going to jump over to the opposite side and bring just a touch of that deeper value. I also added 3 sets of 3 dots here. 3 is my favorite number, so it tends to find its way into my paintings, sometimes without me even realizing it. Explore those little details in your own work too. The marks you naturally reach for again and again may seem small, but over time they become part of your artistic voice. This is where leaving some areas a little bare while you develop the rest of your painting can really work in your favor. It gives you room to come back and incorporate something you discovered along the way. I really love that deep dark corner we created in the upper right, so now I can bring some of that darker value into this leaf as well. That's what's going to help connect the two sides, but it also gives us another layer of depth and contrast. I love working this way, letting one decision lead to the next instead of feeling like I have to know exactly what the finished painting will look like from the beginning. At this point, I'm really just going through the painting and observing. I know I want to add those detail lines to a few of the leaves, but I'm also looking at the piece as a whole and asking where I can use a little more contrast, where I might want to add another darker value, and where an area could use just a bit more texture. I'm especially paying attention to the sides because I want those darker values to feel balanced across the composition and help your eye move from one side of the painting to the other. And then, of course, I'm looking for opportunities to add a little more whimsy. For me, that tends to mean line work, little marks, dots, loose strokes, and occasionally some splatter. All of those tiny details aren't necessarily required to tell you that you're looking at a leaf, but they make the painting feel more like me. And as you're adding your own finishing touches, I really want to encourage you not to get caught up in making everything look realistic. You don't have to include every detail that exists in a real leaf. Instead, ask yourself, what details are interesting to me? Maybe you love the veins of a leaf, so you exaggerate them. Maybe you're fascinated by the way the edges curl, so that becomes something you emphasize. Maybe you couldn't care less about any of that, but you really want to cover your leaves in dots and swirls and tiny hearts. Do that, because when we create, we're making choices about what deserves our attention. Two people can look at the exact same subject and notice completely different things. And when we put those observations onto paper, we're giving someone else a glimpse of how we see the world. I think that's where art starts becoming really interesting. It's not necessarily in how accurately you can produce what's in front of you. It's in what you choose to notice, what you choose to exaggerate, what you simplify, what you leave out, and what you dream up. Those choices tell a story. So as you finish your leaves, don't just ask yourself, what else does this painting need? Ask, what else do I want to say? Maybe the answer is another dark value. Maybe it's 3 little dots. Maybe it's a giant whimsical swirl that exists only because it brings you joy. Follow that curiosity. I've been moving around the painting, adding contrast, a few lines here and there, texture and splatter, and then stepping back again to see how everything is working together. And once it feels like the leaves have said everything I want them to say, we're going to move on to my favorite part, adding a little bit of shimmer. If you've joined me in the studio before, this next step is probably very familiar to you. But if this is your first time painting with me, I'll walk you through how I add shimmer. I'm using the Arteza shimmer palette, which has a really beautiful selection of colors. When I add shimmer watercolor, I usually try to choose colors that closely match what's already on my page. I don't necessarily want the shimmer to introduce an entirely new color, unless it's gold or silver. I want it to complement and enhance the watercolor that's already there. For me, the really magical moment happens at the very end, when I lift the finished piece towards the light. Suddenly, all of those little details catch the light, and they draw your eye toward them, and another layer of dimension that you may not have noticed when the painting was sitting flat on the table. But if you've never used shimmer watercolor before, or shimmer simply isn't your thing, that's completely okay. You don't need it for this painting. Think of this phase as your opportunity to add whatever feels magical to you. Maybe that's a little ink work, acrylic ink, a touch of gold, soft pastel, colored pencils, or another mixed media detail you've been wanting to experiment with. This doesn't have to look like my version of magic. Use this final phase to follow your curiosity and add whatever little details bring you joy. Usually when I get to these shimmer details, I switch over to a smaller brush, but I got so focused painting that I kept using my #1 brush for most of this piece. And that's, again, one of the features of the tapered mop brush, because they're so versatile that sometimes I don't even notice that I need to switch a brush because it's doing what I need it to do. And as I'm adding the shimmer, you'll notice that I'm working pretty quickly and loosely. I'm not trying to carefully cover every leaf or every mark we've created. I just want the shimmer to be very subtle. Just like some of those lines and marks we added earlier, the shimmer is another supporting element. Its job is to add one more layer of magic without competing with our ladybugs. The shimmer also gives me an opportunity to create a little more dimension in the leaves. Because I'm using some of the lighter shimmer colors and applying them with a bit of water, they're fairly transparent. They interact with the watercolor underneath rather than completely covering it. I'm keeping the shimmer on the ladybugs very minimal, just a few red accents on their bodies. I want all those whimsical marks we added earlier to stay nice and crisp, so I'm intentionally leaving those areas alone. As we become more comfortable creating, we don't only get better at knowing what to add, we also get better at knowing when to stop. It can be so tempting, especially at the end of a painting, to keep adding more. Another mark, another layer, another little bit of shimmer, because surely more will make it better. But sometimes the most intentional choice you can make is to leave something alone. Every element doesn't need to sparkle. Every empty space doesn't need a mark. Every leaf doesn't need the same amount of detail. Those quieter areas give your more expressive moments space to shine. And learning that balance really just comes from creating over and over again. You add too much sometimes, you wish you'd add more other times, and slowly you start to develop an instinct for what feels right for you. So don't be afraid of a little restraint. You can always take a step back, look at your painting, and add more if it needs it. But sometimes that little voice telling you, I think that's enough, is worth listening to. And for me, I think I'm going to add one final, larger detail, and that's some lettering in shimmer watercolor. I'm going to use that open space through the center that I've intentionally been saving throughout the painting. I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to fill it with, but as I've been working, something came to me, and I'm going to be adding joy is in the details. I'm doing this completely free-handed, but if that makes you nervous and you want to add some lettering too, please don't feel like you have to do it this way. You can absolutely sketch your lettering lightly in pencil first. I still do that from time to time, especially when I have a very specific composition in mind. But I've also found that sometimes just going for it is how I build confidence. And I want to encourage you to give yourself opportunities to do that. I'm still working on becoming more confident with my lettering. That's one of the reasons I keep pushing myself to include it in my work. I love lettering enough to keep exploring it, even when I know I still have so much to learn. Because I think when we love something enough to keep returning to it, eventually we start to see growth. Not necessarily because we've learned to do it exactly the way someone else does, but because somewhere along the way we begin discovering our own way of doing it. We learn what feels natural with our hands, we notice the shapes and movements we're drawn to, we figure out what works for us. And little by little, it starts to feel less like trying to get it right and more like finding our own way. And that idea of finding your own way is really at the heart of these tutorials. You may notice I give you enough instruction to get started, but I don't walk you through every single mark, and that's intentional. My goal isn't to teach you how to recreate my painting perfectly. It's to show you how I think, how I make decisions, and how I respond when something unexpected happened. So eventually, you feel confident doing those things without me. I want you to leave with more than a painting you love. I want you to leave trusting your hands, your creative eye, and your artistic instincts a little more than when we started. And here it is. Take a moment to look at all the tiny details in your painting. The marks, the layers, those little pops of shimmer. There's so much to discover when you take a closer look.
Thank you so much for joining me in the studio. I hope that you love what you painted, and I'd love to see it because that brings me so much joy. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can share it in the community tab, or if you're watching on Facebook, you can share it in the comments section, or feel free to send me a message on Instagram. And if you love painting these ladybugs, don't forget to check out the tutorial companion guide for further inspiration to continue your explorations. Join me next week for another tutorial, and until next time, stay wild.